ink is black. I want my baby back. It's great, it's great.
Greetings from Castle Goring, from Mickey, Aurora, and from me. We have a special guest with us today, Dorothy Ottey, who is an old friend of mine. She's Jamaican, and she used to know Miss Beryl very well. They grew up in the same village.
Well, I grew up in the village where Miss Beryl lived. She was a lot older than me, of course.
Well, obviously,
and Miss Beryl is the grandmother of Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yes.
And she was just the most delightful lady. I have such fond memories of her. Excuse me. So there's a sweet that you have in Jamaica as a child, or grown-ups eat the sweet that's made from coconuts and caramelized sugar, and it's called a buster. Have you ever had?
Darling, in my day it was called Bustamante Backbone.
Okay, so it was called a buster. And Miss Beryl had a shop. And in the mornings, my Uncle Cecil would take me by the hand. We'd go up the road for a walk. And on the way, everyone that goes past, it would be, "Good morning, Mas Cecil. And how are you, Miss Dar?" And by the time we got to Miss Beryl's shop, she would either offer me a buster or this other delicious sweet called a paradise plum.
Yes, I remember paradise.
Yeah,
plums.
but Miss Beryl, she was just so lovely. We would have these conversations as a little girl whenever I went past with Uncle Cecil, and it was always, "How are you doing with your books? Are you reading? Are you learning your times table?" Of course, she was a businesswoman, so she was very good at things like mathematics, of course. And she was, looking back now, you could see she was a trailblazer. Because the shop that she had, she actually built it herself. So we lived in a village, and her shop was the only what you would call an upstairs, downstairs house. All the other houses were like bungalows on one level with gardens and stuff. I remember in our garden, we had gladiolas. And Grandma, who is not my actual grandmother, she was actually a cousin of ours, but we called her Grandma. And my real grandmother, my mother's mother, we called Mama. But Grandma and Grandma, by the way, my dear, was born in 1879. So by the time I came along, she was a fairly old lady. I remember that she had never driven in a car. But she had been in a horse and carriage. And whenever anyone came up the drive and the car was parked there, she would like to just go and sit in the car. But she'd say, "Whatever you do, don't move. I don't like when it moves." But it was just the most, fascinating place as a child growing up. And we sorry.
Go on.
Yeah.
So your grandmother,
yes,
she was born in 1870, what?
79.
79.
Yeah.
Was she a contemporary of Miss Beryl?
No, she was a lot older than Miss Beryl. So she was one of the oldest people that lived in the village. Here we would call it a village. And everybody called her, would go past, and they would say, "Good morning, Grandma." And then of course my mother across the road, my real grandmother, who was Mama. But it was a really lovely life. We did things such as it was a life where you got up, you had your bath. You got dressed and you had breakfast. You always had a spoonful of cod liver oil and orange juice at breakfast time. That was like a staple every day of the week. And then you would have breakfast, and every day After breakfast, he would sit on the veranda with a jug of lemonade. And then, of course, the newspaper would get delivered. And we had one paper in Jamaica, which was the Gleaner. And our grandma would have the paper open and, you know, she would read all the stories. And the farmers on their way to their fields and stuff would stop by to say good morning. And she would, you know, read them bits of the news. And then they would bid her goodbye and go off for the day.
How many, was it a village or was it a hamlet? How many people would have been in it? How many houses? How many residents?
So at one time, everyone that lived there, was a village. There was probably about 80 or 90 people. But at one time, everyone that lived there was a relative of mine.
Really?
Yes.
What about Miss Beryl?
So this would have been before people such as Miss Beryl moved there. But before that, everyone who lived there, and even as a child growing up, most of the residents were connected in some way on my father's side, my grandfather's side, where they were all related. But Miss Beryl, my darling, also had a son. He was called Kenneth. And Kenneth had a motorbike, the equivalent of what we would now call a Harley Davidson. And of course, so at the time I would have been no more than 4 or 5. I'm not interested in what make your bike is. And he would put me on the front of the bike, you know, whenever I came past with Uncle Cecil. And I would sit there and he would switch the engine on. And of course, looking back now, I realize the bike never moved. But he just held on to me. And I thought I was riding a bike. And I grew up absolutely loving motorbikes. He was very handsome. And Miss Beryl, by the way, I see Vice President Harris on the box. And I sit up straight and I think, my God, she looks so much like Miss Beryl. Her facial features, the only thing is Miss Beryl was much smaller in stature. But
well, okay, if Miss Beryl, because Kamala is very fair-skinned.
Right.
Was Beryl fair-skinned?
Yes, she was.
She was?
She was. She was fair-skinned.
She was? Okay.
Yes, she was very fair-skinned.
Oh.
With black hair.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
So she was so fair-skinned that now that I'm older and I can spot people by their skin colouring, etc., for me, I would say there was something Irish there.
How interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say somewhere along the line, she would have had ancestors that were Irish. Yes.
Actually, can I show you a photograph?
Of course.
Of an old lady.
Yes.
And some people speculate that this is Miss Beryl.
Right.
So, sorry, bear
That's
with me.
okay.
I am so untechnological.
Okay.
It's just pathetic.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. Nah, that's not Miss Beryl.
That's not Miss Beryl.
That's definitely not Miss Beryl.
Okay.
That's not Miss Beryl.
So,
and
let me just show you.
Yeah.
So,
that is not Miss Beryl.
That's not Miss Beryl.
Definitely not Miss Beryl.
Okay.
And I know what she looks like. I couldn't have been in a dream, and she definitely did not look like that.
There's another person, but could that be Miss Beryl?
No, that's not
Miss
Beryl.
Miss Beryl
That's
either.
not Miss Beryl either.
Okay.
Don't know who that is.
Okay. So, you don't have photographs of Miss Beryl?
I don't have photographs.
Well, of course, in those days, nobody took photographs.
That's right.
Photographs are a very recent
That's
thing.
right. But also, when I would have been about 25, 26, my aunt moved back to Jamaica and she lived in my uncle's house, my Uncle Cecil's house. And by then, Miss Beryl no longer had the shop. she built the house next door to my uncle's house.
Mm-hmm.
So the last time I saw Miss Beryl was when my late partner was alive. So I would have been in my...
Tim?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
So when did Timothy die?
So Timothy died 2000.
2000.
Yeah.
So was Miss Beryl alive in 2000?
So she was alive in the 90s.
In the 90s.
Which was when I Tim and I were together. So
No.
she was definitely alive in the 90s.
Okay.
Yeah.
How interesting.
Yes, yes.
That's really intriguing,
Yeah,
Dorothy.
yeah.
What a pity you don't have a
I
photograph.
know, but I am still sort of making inquiries to see if anybody, has a photograph of her. And looking back, I went through a strange phase where most of the photographs of me when I was younger, I threw them away because I thought I was so ugly.
Okay, I see why you thought you were ugly. There's a clear view from here to the other side. Slap me. Slap me. I'm a bad girl. I've just complimented in a back to front way.
You. But of course, I don't know for anybody else, but when you're younger, we all go through what I call, or what my mother used to call, your stupid phase.
Well, everybody's critical of their looks.
Yeah.
I mean, I've known some top models, all of whom are critical of their looks.
Yeah. And of course, it's also from being a model why I was so critical of my looks, hated at things, especially in my nose. Nothing was, was ever right. But yeah.
Well, I would love it if you could get a photograph of Miss Beryl.
I can't promise, but I will try.
I would love it.
Yes, yeah.
Because there's such mystery about Miss Beryl at the moment.
And also...
Can I be rude and ask?
Yeah.
Now this is a very Jamaican conversation.
Yeah.
What colour was Miss Beryl?
So, okay. Miss Beryl was a brown-skinned woman.
Okay.
Yeah.
That says it all.
In fact, I remember her sister.
Uh-huh.
I also remember her sister. But yes, remember, as I say, I have, you look back on things in your childhood, and Miss Beryl, I have very fond memories of going back from I was a child. Lovely, a lovely, kind woman that lived in this house with her son. And I was always so fascinated when she made her new house that was next door to my uncle. So in Jamaica, in the country, you have these big tanks in the garden where they store the water. My dear, Miss Beryl's house, her tank was not in the garden. It was neatly tucked away under the house.
How the heck did they get the catchment?
So they had gutters. I think it's called gutters all around the house, and then the funnels. So when it rained, it went down and underneath.
I remember those catchment tanks.
Yeah.
In all of the houses in the country.
Yeah.
Because of course they didn't have mains electricity, nor did they have mains water.
No. Another thing I can remember growing up is the big lamps with the shades, where you had about 3 or 4 lamps in the drawing room.
What, like the hurricane lamps?
Yes. And they had to be lit by 5:30, 5:45, because Grandma would say if the lamps aren't alight, the angels won't go over the house. She'd say that the angels won't pass over. So all these lamps would be lit,
So do you know why Miss Beryl went to your village? Because it's about 12 miles from Brownstown. Was she originally from Brownstown?
As far as I know, she was not from Brownstown.
Oh, okay.
She was not. She was from one of the other villages near my villages, but she wasn't from Brownstown. I don't know her other son, who is Kamala's father. I know of him, but I have never met him. But of course, her other son, Uncle Kenneth, I have really loving, fun memories of
He
him.
lived in the village.
Yes, he lived with his mother.
And what became of him? Do you know?
He, as far as I know, he lives in America.
Okay.
Yes.
And Kamala's father.
Yes.
You didn't know at
I
all.
have never met him. Never met
But
him.
he was very bright, and he would have gone away quite early to further his education.
So in Jamaica, there are some children that they have an exam. I think when they're about 10. And then they have scholarships. It's a government scholarships, and they go to one of the high schools. Because at one time the school system was totally different from here. You either had a scholarship or you were fortunate enough where your family paid for your education. So I don't know whether his parents paid for his education, but from the stories you read, it talks about him having had a scholarship.
Did you ever meet, if you met Miss Beryl, did you ever meet her husband?
I don't remember her husband, no.
So did you ever meet Uncle Kenneth's father?
No, I've only met her and Uncle Kenneth.
How old was Uncle Kenneth when you met him?
So when I met Uncle Kenneth, he was probably the same age as my Uncle Cecil. So he was probably about 20, or at least in his 20s at the time.
So she really moved when her children were pretty old. She moved to your village when the children were in our day 20 was old.
Right.
Nowadays 20 is a baby.
So I am not aware of when she moved into the village, but as a young child, I remember her being there. But she wouldn't have been one of the original people that lived in the village. But she was very much, part of the village and very well respected in the village.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you happen to know what her surname was? Because, you wouldn't have necessarily, because everybody called everybody by their Christian names.
Everybody, one thing people did not do. So if you were there, you would never be Georgie. You'd be Miss Georgie. And so as a child growing up, you don't think about surnames. For instance, my mother's mother, my paternal grandmother, it was years when I was older that I realized that what her name was, that her name was really Drusilla. And grandma, that her name was Marie. And Goddy was Louise. I knew Goddy was Louise because the villagers would call her Miss Lou. And she was in fact, I meant to bring a picture of her today. She was a lady who loved her pearls. And there's a picture of her standing very straight and, wearing her pearls. And, they were so much ahead of their time because as I grew up, and when I was old enough to go off to school, to boarding school, my headmistress had strict instructions. I was not allowed to do games because I was very tall. And she said, if you do games, you'll be too muscular. And it's not good for a lady to be very muscular and you being tall. So I wasn't allowed to do games. At most of the mornings, I had to sit with my headmistress and have breakfast because she wanted to make sure I was still having my tablespoon of cod liver oil every morning. But
so this was a country boarding school in Jamaica?
I went to St. Hilda's.
You went to St. Hilda's?
Yes.
Oh, I know of St. Hilda's.
Yes, I went to St. Hilda's.
Oh, okay.
And for instance, we had to take we'd take our own linen. You you take things like your own cutlery and your initials. So mine was D134. That was my school number. And anyone that I come across now that goes to St. Hilda's, the first thing I say, we used to hold the spoons up and then look on the handle bit to see who actually owned the piece of silver that you were using, or the napkin rings that you had to take. Everything was engraved with your number. And then, of course, on a Sunday, we go to church down the road to the Anglican church, all walking straight in our little white dresses, with a hat. Incidentally, I was sort of messing about with my phone, and I came across a lady who is American. I think her surname is Owens, and she talked a little about...
Oh, Candice Owens.
Yes. So I listened to this woman, and then I stopped the recording, and I thought, I need to go and make a cup of black coffee. I need a cup of my Blue Mountain to take this in. And I listened, and she was saying, she talked about the Anglican Church, because she said
she's actually spoken to one of Kamala's uncles.
Okay.
Who was a product not of the union with Miss Beryl, but a product of the union with Vioris Lawrence, I think her name was.
Okay.
She was from St. Elizabeth.
Right, okay.
Vioris Lawrence.
Okay,
was
interesting.
from St. Elizabeth.
Interesting.
So.
But I listened to her and I thought, what am I hearing? She was saying things like, she talked about a relative of the vice president being buried in the churchyard in Brownstown, the Anglican church. And she said this woman would have been a helper. Well, trust me, if nothing wrong with being a helper, none of us are perfect. I mean, we all know at one time, our dear Princess Diana gone.
She was a nanny, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if this lady must have had some status to be buried in the churchyard. From what I personally know, being an Anglican, because I went to the subsidiary of that church when I was a child, at a place called a Booker, where Gotti had two pews in the church. One where it was just Gotti and myself, we sat on a Sunday, and the other one was for when she had visitors.
So you're really speaking about established rural landowning families of a measure of prosperity.
Yes.
And a measure of status.
Yes.
That's what. So that's really what you're speaking about.
And in my case, my great grandfather, the land that he had, he divided it up amongst all his sons. And you have people, for instance, she talks about growing sugarcane, and where's the plantation? Hello? I've never seen a sugarcane plantation. The only thing I know in Jamaica...
Sugarcane plantations. Well, remember, she's American, so we don't want to get bogged down with this too much.
We don't.
But in St. Mary and St. Anne, you have sugarcane plantations. You have in St. Catherine, and you have, for instance, Caymanas outside of. But you don't have sugarcane plantations as those of us who are Jamaican would know. She's not Jamaican, so she's not going to know this. They have to be low-lying.
That's correct.
Brownstown is in the mountains. So you can't have sugarcane plantations in the mountains. No, you can't.
And another thing, you will find now the plantations are not owned by one person. The land is sold off in portions where different people plant their crops, but it's no longer owned by one person.
Well, it depends, of course.
Yeah.
Because my cousin Mark Brooks owns the Richmond Landovery estate.
That's a very large.
And then the Hamiltons own Cayman.
Yes,
So, I mean, some of the big great estates still survive.
Yeah.
But let's go back to your childhood and Miss Beryl.
Yes.
So when is the last time you saw her?
So the last time I saw her would have been in the 90s.
Okay, while you were with Tim.
While I was with Tim.
So Tim would have known her.
Tim would have wouldn't I wouldn't say
Well, he'd have
no.
met her.
He would have met her. Yeah. But as you know, Jamaica is an interesting place.
Yes.
Always been an interesting place. And, when you look back in history, you think of the people that are connected with Jamaica. Take, for instance, how often we go along Sloane Square and the man who it's named after. And where did he make his fortune? Jamaica.
Yes.
Well,
Jamaica was the most important colony
Yeah.
in the British Empire
Yeah.
until the abolition of slavery. When America won the Civil War, War of Independence, and I mean, to us it was a civil war. To the Americans, they had their own separate civil war.
Yeah.
But when the American War of Independence was lost by us and won by the Americans, Lord North consoled George III with the thought, well, it doesn't really matter that we've lost the 13 American colonies. We still have Jamaica. So little Jamaica was tremendously important until, and my interpretation of the whole thing is that West Indian sugar ceased to be of any relevance when Napoleon is the one who fostered the beet sugar, the production of beet sugar in Europe. And for instance, vast swathes of Silesia had beet sugar. And then they realized that they could get sugar much more cheaply from the beetroot in North America, in Northern Europe. So they didn't need slavery, they didn't need traveling across. So it made it much neater, cleaner and simpler. And that's when the bottom fell out of I don't know if you learned that in school, but I certainly did, that it was the advent of beet sugar that caused the collapse of the sugarcane industry, which then inevitably led to the marginalization of the West Indies. And Jamaica ceased to be the important colony that it was. But Jamaica then, after the Second World War, had a resurgence of sorts. Because not only did it become the world's most important producer of bauxite, which is necessary for aluminium, but it also became the world's premier winter colony.
Yes, of course.
Hence why people like the Andres ended up having houses in Jamaica. For those of you who don't know, Timothy Andre was a very grand Englishman, a member of the Kleinwort Benson family, and they had the most magnificent house. What was it called again? Unity in Runaway Bay.
That's correct.
I can still see it.
A beautiful house.
And on that note, darling, I'm going to say thank you very much for taking the time to come and share all of these jewels with us.
Us fellow Jamaicans, darling, just have to keep talking about that lovely rock.
Yeah. It's not a rock, Dorothy. What you have on is a rock. It is a jewel.
A jewel.
More than a rock. Well, actually, no, I suppose you're absolutely right. Rocks are the best jewels.
Absolutely.
I stand corrected.
Good.
Thank you, darling, for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank
it's
you
my
so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but I have to tell you upon reflection, I am absolutely gobsmacked by the fact that Dorothy said that the Miss Beryl she knew, and remember, she lived beside her for much of her life, her youth, I should say, and she said she was fair-skinned, and I asked her in the Jamaican vernacular for her colour, and she said brown, which meant not white and definitely not black. And when I showed her the photograph of Miss Beryl that Kamala posted as, well, I tell you what, I'll post that as well as the photograph, because I showed her just Miss Beryl. I cropped Kamala out of the photograph and I showed it on this phone, and then I turned it around to show it to the camera, and when I looked at it later I realized that it wasn't really visible. I suppose it must be if you sort of zero in closely, but I'm not very technological. So I'm going to be asking Sean to post the photograph of Miss Beryl that I cropped Kamala out of, that comes from Kamala's autobiography, where she, and then I show a photograph of Vioris Lawrence, who then married Kamala's grandfather, and she didn't recognize Vioris as being Miss Beryl. In fact, she didn't recognize Vioris at all. And then I'll show the photograph of Beryl, Miss Beryl, with Kamala, where Kamala boldly asserts that that is her paternal grandmother, when it clearly isn't. Now, this raises such questions, and I don't understand, says I, trying to avoid getting sucked into the toxicity of American politics. But actually, I do understand. I think Kamala discovered that her little bit of black blood would play very well with the black electorate in America. I mean, she certainly had an example, because Barack Obama, who was brought up by purely white parent and grandparents and sent to the finest schools because they were all very prosperous, and didn't have a black experience either in Indonesia or Hawaii. He was raised primarily in Indonesia, and he only, shall we say, discovered being black when he entered politics. Until then, he was as he ought to have been, colourless. Now, I have a great deal of respect for Barack Obama's dignity and his gracious presentation, but I understand from Black Americans that if you dig more deeply, his identification with Black America is actually an artificial construct. And it would appear that it worked for him to become black. I mean, there's no doubt Michelle Obama's black. And there's no doubt that his children are primarily black. But he is half black. He's what used to be called a mulatto, a racial categorization that was extremely accurate and descriptive. He's not black. And Kamala has even less black in her than Barack Obama, but obviously she has been politically ambitious pretty much most of her adult life, and I'm not criticizing her for that. I'm just making a statement of fact. And she did go to Black University, but I cannot believe that her Indian mother, because the Indians are very proud of their heritage, would have been bringing her two daughters up to be black when the least of their racial identity was sub-Saharan African and the most was Indian. So I think that again is a political ploy. Well, it's not up to me as a foreigner to really go too deeply into whether I would approve or disapprove of somebody who makes such use of really what in Jamaica they used to call her touch of the tar brush, because that was the expression that they used to use in Jamaica. And she is on her father's side Jamaican, and it's perfectly valid to use Jamaican terms in this instance. Well, I hope that I have not antagonized all of Kamala's admirers who also view this show, because it's not my intention. I'm actually dumbfounded. I was expecting that Dorothy would have said, "Oh yes, that's Miss Beryl." It looks as if whatever she did, well, let's leave it at that. Oh, I'm gobsmacked. Absolutely gobsmacked. And it then begs the question, did she seriously think she was going to be able to get away with this? I mean, I know Candace Owens has been going hell for leather on this, and Candace Owens is clearly black. So this is not about anti-blackness, because as you could see, Dorothy is not white. So, I mean, I'm just stunned that any ambitious politician would present as a grandparent of hers, and Kamala Harris is very fair-skinned, whether she calls herself black or brown, she's still fair-skinned. But she definitely has black blood. So to that extent, it's not anything artificial. What does seem to be extraordinary is the creation of a black grandmother when her grandmother was of color but wasn't black. And she just, did she get somebody off the street and pop them in the photograph? Was it a helper? Who was this woman? I mean, it boggles the imagination. But politicians do strange things. I'm just beyond stunned that A, she did it, and B, she could have thought she'd get away with it. And so to all of the people who asked me to investigate and come up with the truth, well, I've investigated. I'm very grateful to Dorothy for having come all the way from London to be interviewed. I'm stunned. I keep on repeating myself, but I'm absolutely stunned. And beyond that, I can only say, any supporters of Kamala Harris who are offended, don't be offended by the fact, my dear, that I have asked a neighbour of Miss Beryl whether Miss Beryl is Miss Beryl or not. I have committed no offence, and if you're going to be offended, I would suggest you be offended by the individual who uttered the sleight of hand. So let's leave it at that. I'm slightly, actually, well, let's leave it at that, because, I mean, I can't believe that this has happened, but it has happened, and I'm afraid I am not shying away from what I regard as my duty to fact. I mean, I just am stunned, just making up a grandmother. But I tell you, one good thing about it is that it shows people of African heritage all over the world that being black is now so desirable that a leading politician will substitute her brown grandmother with a black woman. So it rarely begins to look as if that thing called white privilege, which of course never really existed, just ask all the miners, ask poor whites whether they were privileged, and they'll tell you they weren't. But this artificial construct of white privilege is being replaced by black privilege, which I suppose in some ways is actually quite, well, it's certainly an advancement on the previous situation. Because when I was a child, especially in the United States of America, to be black was not as desirable as being white. Now, to be nearly white or brown is nowhere near as, or white is nowhere near as desirable as being black. And we have it in the first president of colour of the, acknowledged president of colour, because I believe that there was a previous president who was of colour, but it was not acknowledged at the turn of the last century. So the first acknowledged president of colour, a mulatto, half white, half black, expunged all of his whiteness, expunged his white heritage, and embraced being black. Then you have this half Indian, as Dorothy said, Irish. Miss Beryl was partly Irish. You could tell just by looking at her. Her colouring was Irish. I keep on repeating it because I'm making a point, and the point I'm making is that in some ways this can be viewed as really positive about the advancement that people of colour have made. Because when Imitation of Life was first made in the 30s and then in the, I think it was the 50s, black people wanted to pass for white. Meghan, born in 1981, she passed for white for most of her life. Now she's blacker than the ace of spades, and so is Kamala. And so is Kamala's grandmother, the brown woman called Beryl. Unbelievable. I don't know what you make of it, but I have to tell you, as a Jamaican, I am in some ways delighted that the black race has advanced to the extent where black is not only beautiful, it is preferable to anything else. So I think we're beginning to look at real sea changes in the cultural perceptions. Whether they are acknowledged yet or not is beside the point. Why? I mean, I will say that I had a different ending. I was ending it with Dorothy. And then I thought, hang on a second, no. When I looked at the tape back and saw that Miss Beryl's photograph that I did like this, of course there's nothing on the screen now, that it didn't show clearly. So I am now going to ask Sean to post Miss Beryl, followed by Vioris, Cambridge, white woman from St. Elizabeth, Germantown in St. Elizabeth, where they had a large white population. It was not regarded as, well, let me rephrase that. They were out of the mainstream of what was called society, not meaning Jamaican society generally, meaning white upper class society. They were not a part of it. But they certainly married as into respectable circles, and they were themselves regarded as respectable people. But they were not a part of the elite, whether it was white or brown or black. They were not a part of the elite, generally speaking. So that's where Vioris came from. And then you have the photograph of Miss Beryl with Kamala asserting that that is her grandmother when it isn't. And on that note, I'll say thank you very much for listening, and hope the messengers doesn't get shot. But I'm clearly not going to be able to ignore this or lie about it. So I think the questions should be asked of Kamala. But I think I know the answers, I've said. I think it plays well politically for brown people to pretend to be black, to the uneducated black segment of the voting public in the United States of America. There are lots of black people who do not go along with this. And personally speaking, I think no one should go along with it. You shouldn't be voting for people according to their racial identity. You should be voting for them according to their character and their ability to serve the nation's interests effectively. But it's up to people how they want to vote. And on that note, I'll say, I actually sort of regret having entered the fray at all. And nevertheless, it is my duty to stand by my findings, and I'm standing by them. And on that note, I'll say thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been of some interest to you. If it has, please keep the questions and comments coming in so that I will know what you would like us to be speaking about. Thank you so much. Take good care. Godspeed. And if you have truly enjoyed this, would you care to like, share, subscribe, press the notification bell, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.